Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We are deeply privileged to have all of you take time out of your summer agendas to come and worship with us together. We think it's so important for the people of God to unite and just come together and encourage one another in these dark and difficult times. So you've come on a good Sunday because I want to share a secret with you. Top secret. Remember, you heard it here first, so here it is. Listen carefully. The world that we live in, this world here and now, it's more than a little bit messed up. I know, shocking, right? It's kind of messed up out there. You know, sometimes we walk around, we look around at what's happening in our country, what's happening in our world, and then what's happening in our communities and in our family, and sometimes we just shake our head and we ask ourselves this question: what in the world is going on around here? What's going on? How do we diagnose all this chaos? How do we respond to it? What do we do about it? How are we supposed to perceive ourselves? What is our role in the middle of all this? Well, we've been walking through a series here. We're in week 2 of that series called Radical. 4 visions that change everything. We've been taking a broad, sweeping look at the prophet and the ministry of Ezekiel. A prophet and a priest to whom God gloriously and radiantly reveals himself through this vision, this heavenly holy of holies, surrounded in light, surrounded in fire, surrounded by those majestic creatures known as cherubim, right in the middle of his own mess. God is revealing to Ezekiel, whose world was crumbling around him, this series of messages framed in these 4 great visions. Last week we saw that big vision of God, which Ezekiel saw in the land where he was living. That big, glorious vision of God. And so this week we began in that same place with that same vision, but unfortunately it's going to turn in a disturbing direction. So let me invite you to turn to your notes, which I put in your bulletin. We're going to pick up the story this week in chapter 8. This is the second vision that Ezekiel sees. It begins this way: in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came on me there. I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire. And from there up, his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. And there before me was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen in the plain. Then he said to me, Son of man, look toward the north. So I looked, and in the entrance north of the gate of the altar, I saw this idol, jealousy. So you remember Ezekiel now was living in Babylon. He was among some 10,000 exiles, captives, whom Nebuchadnezzar had forced from their homeland in Jerusalem when he attacked there in about 597 BC. He forced them all into captivity now in Ezekiel. And while he was there, into Babylon, and while Ezekiel and these captives were there in Babylon, God revealed himself in this glorious way to the prophet. But now the Spirit is about to show Ezekiel what's happening back in the homeland, what happened among those who were left behind in Jerusalem. And so this mysterious, powerful messenger of God unceremoniously picks Ezekiel up by the hair, and the Spirit of God takes him through a visionary sort of way, some 550 miles to the city of Jerusalem, and drops him in front of the temple. Ezekiel hits the ground, and he's told to look up, and when he looks up, he sees this same vision he saw when he was in Babylon, but now he also sees an idol. The idol is described as an idol of jealousy or an idol that provokes jealousy. I think it's called that because God looks at this idol as a rival to his people's affections and his devotion, which he himself deserves. Now, we don't know exactly what this idol looked like, but the truth is it could have looked like any of the idols in the surrounding nations. Because the people of God had this horrible habit called idolatry. They'd go to the nations around them and find a god that they liked, and they'd bring them into the temple precincts. And just add the idol to the worship of Yahweh, their God. There was these other idols there. But this was not all. This was just the beginning. Ezekiel would see even more detestable things. The Spirit leads him through the gate, takes him into a courtyard, and then he hears this messenger tell him to dig through an earthen wall. And he's led through that opening into an inner courtyard, and there he sees this group of leaders of Israel bowing down to various idols of all types, images of unclean animals, all sort of creepy, crawly things. They're bowing down right there in the temple to these things. But this is not all. He would see even more detestable things. And the Spirit takes him north, towards the north gate, and there he sees a group of women worshiping Tammuz, the Babylonian god. The Babylonians who had just taken his people captive. People were still in the temple grounds worshiping this god. But that was not all. Ezekiel would see even more detestable things. He leads them back into the courtyard itself, in between the altar and the sanctuary, and there were a group of men bowing down, worshiping the sun god in the east with their back towards the temple. Here it was, all this idolatry, right in the sacred precincts of the temple dedicated to the name of God. Those precincts in which Ezekiel as a priest had ministered year after year. Now, all this idolatry all the way through. And now God had called Ezekiel to bear witness to all this. And after this disturbing tour, God confronts Ezekiel with a question. Look at verse 17. He said to me, "Have you seen this, Son of Man? Is it a trivial matter for the people of Judah to do the detestable things that they are doing here? Must they also fill the land with violence and continually arouse my anger? Look at them putting the branch to their nose." Now, I don't know what kind of religious ritual it is that prescribes that you stick a branch up your nose, but it sounds kind of silly to me. And I really think that's the point. God's people are acting like fools, worshiping all these other idols and images. And he's called Ezekiel to bear witness to all this foolishness. At its root, idolatry is basically means choosing the wrong God. And by the way, the wrong God is anyone or anything that is not the one true God. Which helps us understand the meaning of the word idol. Idol is an image or a copy of the real thing. And this is what's frustrating God about his people. He has revealed himself to his own people as the real God, as the true God, as the real thing. See, the rest of the world, they don't know. They can't understand. They don't know who God is. They've been victims generation after generation of lostness. But God, in the middle of all these people, chooses this one people, and he says he reveals himself as the real thing. But for all sorts of reasons, all sort of foolish reasons, these people decide not to accept the real thing. Instead, they prefer to worship the image and the copy. Who in their right mind would want to worship the fake? The image, the copy? Who wouldn't want the real thing? Well, maybe it's because the real thing demands too much. Maybe it's because the real thing, the real God, won't give us everything we want whenever we want it. Maybe the real God tells us we have to wait a while. He's working. Maybe it's because the real God demands holiness and we would rather chase after pleasure. For all sorts of reasons, we feel the need to redefine God, to reimagine God, to recreate God in a way a little more that's like our own image, a little more user-friendly, a little more cooperative. So, for example, our God, the real God, the true God, tells us who we're allowed to sleep with and who we're not allowed to sleep with. But wouldn't we prefer a God that maybe is a little more flexible about these things? A little more relaxed about the whole sex thing? The real God says, love your neighbor as yourself. But maybe we'd like a God that lets us kind of choose who we want to love and who we want to hate, to pick the people we should care about. And the real God says, you belong to me. You're my people. I own you. First and foremost, you belong to me. Everything about you. But we would prefer a God that maybe just asks a little bit of us, maybe a day, a week or so, or a holiday, a little bit of our treasure, and then fundamentally leaves us alone to chase whatever we want to chase. We would like a part-time God, please. For all sorts of reasons, we find ourselves in this trap where we're constantly tempted to redefine God in our own image, a God that's a little more user-friendly to what we want to do. So let me ask you a question. Do you think idolatry still goes on here? You think it still goes on in our world? Maybe we're not sticking branches up our noses, but we're doing the functional equivalent. I can only tell you that for me, it's been a battle. For years, I created a God right here. As I was serving you as your pastor, I was worshiping another God that I created all by myself. That God allowed me to eat whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. He was a great God. A little more to my liking. Until one day, about a year ago, through a series of events, I heard a question from God. It says, do I own you, or do you own yourself? Are you worshiping me? Or are you worshiping someone else? And I came to a shocking conclusion. I was a foolish idolater. I was allowing other idols into this body, this temple, and I was just as foolish as my ancient cousins, worshiping a God that I created in my own image, a little more user-friendly to myself. But here's the problem. If we continue to create this God in our own image, the one that fits us a little bit more, there are going to be consequences. Creating our own God eventually leads to judgment. Look again at the text, chapter 9, verse 1. This voice cries out, "Then I heard him call out in a loud voice, 'Bring near those who are appointed to execute judgment on the city, each with a weapon in his hand.' And I saw 6 men coming from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. With them was a man clothed in linen, who had a writing kit at his side. They came in and stood beside the bronze altar." These 6 men, they're representing the armies of Babylon. They were marauding invaders that were soon to descend. Babylon was one of those nations that the people of God wanted to emulate. They were worshiping their gods, but very soon those gods were going to turn on them. They were going to be the destroyers. And God was going to use these unholy foreign invaders to execute his own holy judgment upon his own people. And then there's a mysterious seventh figure. He's in the linen of a high priest. And this high priest, he has a crucial role to play. Look at verse 3. Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been, and moved to the threshold of the temple. Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen, who had the writing kit at his side, and said to him, "Go through the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over the detestable things that are done in it." Now, typically, the holy presence of God, the premier symbol in the temple of God's presence, it was preserved in the Holy of Holies behind that sacred curtain. Nobody was allowed to go in there except for the high priest once a year for the Day of Atonement, after he had made for atonement for himself or for his family. What is happening now is that holy presence of God is about to break out from that temple, from that Holy of Holies, into the courtyard, into the areas of the temple, and then outside the temple into the surrounding city of Jerusalem. And you see the clash coming. What happens when the powerful holiness of God, that pure, powerful holiness of God, encounters idols and idolatry? You can be sure when those two forces meet, judgment is going to happen. But before that judgment is unleashed, this priest has a job to do. He goes out and he marks the head of those faithful few, that remnant, who through in the midst of this culture of idolatry had rejected it and decided instead that they're going to do everything they can to worship the one true God. They're going to buck the culture. They're going to be countercultural. The priest marks them out. I want you to hold that image in your mind. They're going to be important, that remnant, to how this story works out. And just hold that image for a moment. We'll get right back to it. But after the priest fulfills this mission and marks out these people, then the judgment is unleashed. These invading warriors now go through the temple and then through the city, destroying and annihilating everything in their path. The judgment is brutal and bloody. Men, women, innocent children just swallowed up into the destruction, the brutality of these foreign invading armies. Look at chapter 11, verse 8. God says, "You fear the sword, and the sword is what I will bring against you, declares the sovereign Lord. I will drive you out of the city and deliver you into the hands of foreigners and inflict punishment on you. You will fall by the sword, and I will execute judgment on you at the borders of Israel. Then you will know that I am the Lord." It's a horrific perspective, isn't it? That the holy God of Israel will judge his own people, his own land, his own city, his own temple. And to anyone who thinks they can flee and escape out of the city, judgment will catch them on the borders. There is no escape. Judgment will happen. Judgment will be fulfilled. And when it's all done, there will be no choice but to acknowledge that there is only one God, the one true God. And this is the sad part. That this vision that Ezekiel sees right now, it's going to happen. Now it's a vision, but it's going to happen in history. Within 6 years of Ezekiel's vision, Nebuchadnezzar's armies invade Jerusalem again. Only this time, they don't leave anything standing. They rape, pillage, destroy everything in their path. They take everything of value out of the temple that had been standing since Solomon's day, and they razed it to the ground. Judgment had come. The armies were real. Real men, women, and children, innocent victims in this terrible devastation, judgment. Judgment, it's a tragic reality. It's one we don't like to think about that much. But I think this image of judgment that we see here, it's important for us to look at. It's important for us to think about. In fact, it's so important, it's the majority message in Ezekiel. If you read through the whole book, which I hope you will have an occasion to do through our series, you will see the vast majority of it is about judgment. Which is probably why Ezekiel isn't on that top 10 list of books Christians read. There's not a lot of warm fuzzies there, let me just tell you in advance. But I think we should reflect and we should think. Because I think if we look carefully at the story, we will find ourselves in that story. I think what we see there is a reflection, an image, a mirror image of the turbulent times in which we live. I mentioned earlier that judgment happens when we choose to worship our own gods that we create rather than the one true God. But when we make that choice, there's a problem. Because these gods we create, these images, the copies, they don't really exist. Those gods, they're figments of our own imagination. They don't really exist. They didn't create us. They didn't make us. They didn't design us. They don't know what make us tick. They don't know how our communities were meant to function. They don't know how our families are meant to function. There's only one person that knows all of this, and that's the one true God who made us. And we ignore his instructions to our own peril. So the short answer to the question, why all the mess around us? It's because we made a fatal choice. We chose to worship these other gods. We rejected the one true God. We've chosen instead to do everything our own way. That's all we've done. We don't want God in his way. We want to make our own way. And so we kind of invent these other images of God that suit our liking, but all we're really doing is rejecting the one true God and doing it our way. And here's what happened with doing it our way, this mess. God has stepped back, it seems to me, and allowed us to kind of earn what we've deserved here as a collective human race, all these generations, choosing to do things our own way. We are now living through the brutal consequences of our own bad decisions. All those gods that we really want to worship, the money, the power, the sex, the wealth, the luxury, the fame, the celebrity, all those things that we worship on a daily basis, here's the problem. They're coming back to destroy us. They are now the armed warriors who are invading our sacred precincts and taking us captive. Look around you. The sex trafficking that's going on, the drug trafficking that's going on, all the fighting for power. What do you think's underneath that? There's this desire to have and worship these things that will destroy us. That's what we see around us. Idolatry being judged. This is what happens. God has given us our way. He's allowed us to create our own gods. He hasn't judged us yet. How do you think this is going for us so far? Working out well, right? But thankfully, this is not the end of the story. Thankfully, God has not given up on us despite our foolish mistakes, despite our foolish decisions, despite our chasing after pleasure. God has not given up on his people. He will have his nation. And so he speaks to these exiles that have been taken captive. They're victims of the judgment, carried away to live in this pagan culture. God speaks words of hope. Look at verse 17, chapter 11. He instructs his prophet, "Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. They will return to it, remove all its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God." See, God is going to restore his people and his nation. Be assured of that. He's not given up. But this new people, it's not going to be restored through war or politics. No, this new people of God is a spiritual people of God. He's going to go after their hearts. He's going to change them from the inside. He's going to give them a new spirit. They're going to have an undivided heart, not a heart that's divided between all these gods, but a heart divided or dedicated to the one God. A heart of flesh, not a heart of stone, not a hard heart that doesn't want to obey God, but a soft heart that loves and is devoted to God passionately, who does what God commands because we want to, because we love to, not just because we have to. This is God's great plan for a new people. Rebuild them spiritually. And an important part of this plan is through this remnant. These people that somehow have lived through the judgment, they've survived the judgment, yet remained faithful. See, we're back to that image we saw earlier of this high priest that found those faithful people, put a mark on them, and said, "I'll protect you through the judgment. Somehow you'll survive." These people, they become the basis for a new work. They become the start of a new people of God. Out of the ashes of destruction, this new creation would emerge, this new spiritual creation of God. And by the way, this new people, this new spiritual people, they're being started in this foreign land. They're no longer in the land of Israel. They're no longer in the holy city. They're no longer in the holy temple. All that's gone. But it turns out God is not confined to one place and one time. It turns out that the presence of God can be anywhere, even among these exiles in this pagan culture. In fact, the last piece of this vision, the last episode, if you will, of this vision, is God's decision to leave his own city. Look at verse 22. Then the cherubim with the wheels beside them spread their wings, and the glory of Israel was above them. And the glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the exiles in Babylonia, and in the vision given by the Spirit of God. Then the vision I had seen went up for me, and I told the exiles everything that the Lord had shown me. After the destruction of his holy city, after the destruction of the temple, this heavenly image of the Holy of Holies, this lived out image, moves, leaves city, and settles on a mountain east. It's a sad, sad picture, a sure sign of judgment. But it stays there on that mountain. And the truth is, this is not the end of the story. We will see that mountain again. It's east of the city. Later, it becomes known as the Mount of Olives. In some 600 years from this event, there'll be a presence of God still on that city called Jesus Christ, who is himself God. In the last week of his life especially, he spends a lot of time on that mountain. And in fact, it's from that mountain that our Lord and Savior ascends again to be with the Father. So this word of judgment, it's not the last word. Judgment is not the last word. No, God is not done with his people. He has begun this work of restoration. He has started to rebuild his people, even if his city and even if his temple is destroyed. God's work is not done. And he will give Ezekiel now 2 more visions about this work of restoration. And so come back for the next 2 weeks. We're going to look at the restoration. We're going to look at what God is doing, how he's rebuilding his people. What is our role in it? What is our part of it? How do we fit into this plan? But for right now, can we just go back to the first question that we asked this morning? What in the world is going on around here? I've argued that idolatry is going on, I think. Judgment is going on, yes. But I would also argue that restoration is going on. God is rebuilding his spiritual people. And this remnant that you see here with Ezekiel and faithful, he's still at work among a remnant. In fact, most of us, we believe we're part of that remnant. We think we're part of the solution. We think we've done everything we can do to follow the one true God. We believe as part of our mission here on earth, we're supposed to reflect that. But I want us to learn a few things from this passage about what it means for us if we claim to be the remnant of God. If we claim to be God's people in this day and age, in this dark day and age in which we live, what does it mean to be the people of God, the remnant, the true remnant that worships the true God? Well, I think there are 4 truths we need to take away from this sermon this morning. 4 truths that we should take away from this city, from this story. And the first truth is this: our high priest, Jesus Christ, must mark us out if we're going to survive all this. How do we know we'll survive this mess? How do we know that we'll get through this? It's not because of us. It's not because of our effort. No, our own sin, our own destructive nature, our own tendencies to idolatry, not to mention the severity of the judgment of this world, it will destroy us. It will overcome us. The only way we survive this mess is if our holy high priest has come along and put a mark on us and says, "You are mine." We survive, we go on, we maintain, we live through it only because our high priest has marked us and said, "This is mine. This is my survivor." But the second truth is this. And this one maybe we don't like so much, the second truth. Turns out we're going to have to live through this judgment. We're going to have to live through this mess. We would like to escape. We would like to run away. We'd like to flee the city, go somewhere where it's nice, you know? We don't get to run away. Ezekiel didn't get to run away. He got forced out, but he had to live among the pagan culture. He had to live in the mess. God has placed us in this mess to be a message to the world. You see, how is the world going to know who the one true God is unless in the midst of this crisis there's a people surviving that worship the one true God faithfully? That's our role. That's our job. We don't get to run away. Not until God calls us home. Which leads us to the next truth. If we're supposed to be this witness out there to a world that's falling apart, then we better be working very hard to clear out the idols that we're building up in our own lives. God has been teaching me that over the last year. I got to work harder at clearing out the idols that I've let clutter up inside the body of my temple. Because He knows how I will survive. He knows what makes me tick. If I'm going to choose to worship these other gods and allow them into my life, then you can bet it's not going to work. So if we're going to be the restored people of God, if we're going to be the remnant, then we have to be at the business of letting him create that new soft heart in us, that new spirit in us. It serves God because we want to with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love him. So there's no room for idols in our lives. We need to go about the business of cleaning them out. And then there is this last truth. We don't have to do this alone. The last truth, that God has not abandoned us to the mess. God never disappeared. He left that temple, yes, but he never left his people. He was there wherever they were, no matter where they went, even to Babylonia. In the very pit of hell, there was God with his people. God has not abandoned us to this mess. No, his spirit is alive and well. And next week, we're going to look at that even more carefully. But as we are engaged in this effort of worshiping him, we don't do it on our own. We're not going to survive it on our own. We count on his presence to take us through. So this is how we answer this question. What in the world is going on around here? Yes, there's idolatry going on. Yes, there is judgment going on. But there's also restoration that goes on. Now we're just down to that final question. Are you part of the solution? You can call yourself a Christ follower, or you can be out there wandering around. Whatever the definition you give yourself, the question is, are you part of the solution? What are we doing to root out all the other things we worship in our lives and worship God and God alone? It's an important question. Everything depends on getting this right. Because if we see this vision of the one true God who's revealing himself to us, our response to him is critical. And how we respond, it changes everything. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this story, as hard as it is to hear. No one wants to hear judgment. We want to hear encouragement, inspiration, and yet here we are listening to a story of judgment. But it's a sober message that we have to look at. It's looking in the mirror with hard truth. It's an intervention of sorts, perhaps to many of us, that just need to stop fooling ourselves about who we worship. Father, our prayer is that you work in our hearts and souls to make us this spiritual people of God with a new spirit and a new heart that's done being addicted and enslaved to all this stuff. We want to be part of the free people of God with the power of God's Spirit breathing within us. Father, may you continue to help us to learn and grow, and develop, and be faithful, so that we may indeed help a world that is suffering the judgment to find the restoration. We ask that in the name of Christ Jesus our Lord.